Just so bright. Does it matter if these are on?
No, no.
Okay.
No, because I've got to wear mine.
It's very glary. I mean,
Yes, isn't it?
Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Mrs. Hasegawa, one of the interesting things about Geelong's history is how complicated it is, and how, for instance, people think of Geelong just as a British Anglo-Saxon sort of a place in the 19th century and right up to the present, but in fact there were many other nationalities present in this area, and including among them the Japanese, who were probably expect them least of all to be here, but in fact there were quite a number of Japanese laundries. How many actually were established?
Well, I know of 6. It's, I think I named them for you.
Yes.
But they all came here as students.
What are their names? Can you run through the names again for us?
Yes, well, there was Hasegawa, which was my own father-in-law. There was Faria, who lived in Meyer Street. Ito, who had a laundry in Ryrie Street. Nangai had a place in Mallup Street. Naka was in West Geelong. Nakamura was in Murrabble Street near the Bowen Bridge. And Ikanaka was in Yarra Street.
And what year did they come to Australia, and how did they come?
Well, they came steerage, oh no, I can't remember the name of the boat, but they landed here on Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897 to learn to speak English as spoken. That was their words. They were all educated, highly educated men. And they came to a, can we name him?
Yeah.
Colonel Tackett in St Kilda Road, who didn't do the things he promised and treated them more as slaves than students, you know, exchange students. And they got stuck here. And here they had to remain. None of them could get back to their own country because a Japanese gentleman never asks his family for help.
And when they made a bit of money later on, did they consider returning?
Well, some of them thought of returning, but none of them ever made it. I don't think there was one man became a lecturer in the Melbourne University, one of the chaps. Some of them went all over Victoria. They went to Ballarat, Geelong, all around the suburbs of Melbourne, and gradually these 6 settled here in Geelong.
Could you just tell us a little more about the Colonel Tackett story? Where
Well, my grandson has investigated the thing and found that the Colonel was found guilty of misconduct and was charged. And the men, my father-in-law was there given menial tasks to do, and was forbidden to study. And when he was studying, the Colonel came along with a whip and whipped his books away from him. And after 3 months of this treatment, my father-in-law walked into Russell Street in Melbourne, and he reported the matter there, and the police came down and released all of those who wanted to go. But none of them had any capital. They hadn't had any wages or anything for the work they were doing.
So why did they? How and why did they get into the laundry business?
Well, I think the whole thing was water didn't cost anything, and soap was cheap, and they had, I think my father-in-law had 30 shillings from Colonel Tackett for 3 months' wages, and there was nothing else they could do at the time with such a little capital. So they started up laundries. My father-in-law's first laundry was in Toorak Road between Punt Road and Caroline Street.
He might have ended up washing the Colonel's washing.
He was doing the Colonel's washing. The Colonel had 2 nursing sisters who worked in the Alfred Hospital, and he had to wash their white uniforms daily, and also yards and yards of white tablecloths, and iron them and everything. For a man who had been well educated, it was a very menial task.
But they must have somehow assimilated or whatever, liked the country well enough at least to stay, because presumably they made enough money in, say, 5 or 10 years out of their laundries to make a trip back to Japan. I mean, wouldn't have been all that difficult to travel back?
No, I don't know why they sort of stayed. I think it might have been because they didn't want to go back beaten, defeated.
Right.
That's what I think.
Yes, yes. So what happened in the... they dispersed then, didn't they? They all seemed to come to Geelong. Is that right? Is there any particular reason?
Not all of them. I think one would come to Geelong and say the business there was better than it was in Melbourne, and so another would come. My father-in-law came here probably in 1904 into a little shop in Mercer Street, and he had 2 sons born in Mercer Street. But he left Geelong and went to Ballarat for a while. And then he came from Ballarat, he went to Melbourne. He was in Malvern Road and he was in Caulfield, you know.
In that area?
Yeah. Rents were cheap, you see, and they didn't have a lot of capital. And in about 1912, I can't be sure of the date, he came out of the laundry business and opened up an importing business. But when the 1914 war came, he couldn't get the stuff over from Japan, and of course he had to go back to laundry and lost his money in the importing business and went back to laundry work.
These Japanese men who came over, I mean, they didn't come over with any women or children, did they?
No, none of them brought a spouse. None of them brought any family at all.
So they all married here, did
and
they?
None of them left family at home. Right. They only left parents and brothers and sisters.
So they were late teens and early 20s?
Oh yes, I think my father-in-law, if he was born in 1871 and he died in... He arrived here in 1897. He must have been 26 years of age. He'd finished his
studies.
Yes, he'd graduated from university, Tokyo.
Had they all graduated? Had they all gone through uni? Had they?
All but Freya. Freya never went through university, but the others were all.
They sort of saw themselves as Rotary exchange students more than.
That was the way they were classed in those days, but they weren't treated that way when they got here.
No. And they presumably all married local girls then, is that?
Well, they all married Victorian girls. My father-in-law married a girl who lived in Caulfield. Her name was Cole, Ada Cole.
And what was the situation you have, do you imagine or do you remember that you had various Japanese laundrymen marrying into European families in Melbourne and Geelong? Was this accepted quite happily at the time, or was there...
No, I don't think so. I think you were sort of looked down upon because you had married out of your own nationality, but after all, we're a very mixed race, aren't we?
Who are?
We, the Australians.
Oh, yes. So did you yourself have any pressures or comments passed on later in the century?
Well, my mother died when I was very young, and I'm afraid I would never have been allowed to marry my husband had she lived, but we went to school together in South Yarra, and we grew up for a while together, parted and met again and married, and I was too young or too silly to realise if anybody was passing any derogative remarks, but I've never found any trouble, but my children did.
What sort of trouble have they found?
Well, my second eldest daughter tells me that she was stoned in World War II because she had Japanese blood in her.
What, walking to school in Geelong?
Yes, in Geelong here. Some of the children would be alive today to remember who they were that did it, I should say.
Yes, quite. And that Second World War episode is very interesting because, of course, Japan were allies of Australia and Britain in the First War.
Yes.
So presumably these various laundrymen, which are pretty well established by 1940-41, and then Pearl Harbor comes along, and what actually happened on Pearl Harbor Day?
Every one of them were closed down, and the police came in and arrested them and took them down to the Geelong lockup, and they were there held for 2 or 3 days before they were taken to Tatura.
You're talking about men in their late 60s and early 70s.
70s, yes. Yeah, none of them under 60. Right. None of them under 60.
How many people, how many military did it take to arrest your father?
There were 13 came just to take an old man in his 70s out of his sick bed. They were put up into Tatura. I made 2 visits up there, and we were only allowed to look at each other and talk to each other in the company of soldiers. And when we eventually got him freed, before the war was finished, he wasn't allowed to leave the house. He was kept in the house, and we had to have even the barber had to come and cut his hair.
And there was that incident of the film, remember?
Yes, I did want to take him to see Gone with the Wind because he used to love his theatre. He used to go every Saturday night to the pictures. And come Gone with the Wind, and I went down and asked the police if I could take him to the pictures, and I was refused, so that he didn't get to see Gone with the Wind.
In the, say, since Second World War, do you notice in your very large family, far-flung family, that that sort of Japanese heritage was denied or has been brought back to life in any way?
In my family, we've all, never been ashamed of the fact that there was any Japanese in them. And I have one grandson. That's what you want me to say? Yeah. It's been over in Japan for 2.5 years, studying Japanese and teaching English over there, and intends going back again. But found it very interesting, found his grandfather's old hometown, was interviewed on Radio Japan, and had a great experience. Met a descendant of another branch of the family who was afraid to admit any knowledge of the family in case he lost the property that would have been my father-in-law's descendants had he stayed in Japan.
And would you say that most of these relatives now, I mean, it's apart from that one grandson, that the interest is either not there or they'd rather not know about it?
Oh no, my family are all very interested. Oh, yeah. None of them deny their heritage at all.
Have any of the other branches have changed their name and gone to it?
Yes, my father-in-law had 3 sons. The 2 younger boys changed their name from Hasegawa to Cole, which was their mother's maiden name, way back in 1952 after the death of their father. But my children have never changed their names, only by marriage.
Mrs. Hasegawa, what did you think about that internment business in the Second World War? You have the situation where the sons could be
serving
in the military.
Army. The sons were serving in the army and the fathers were interned. It was very cruel because they were all aged men and they were all true to Australia. They remained Japanese citizens, I think mainly because of the White Australia policy, which never allowed them to be naturalised. Yeah. And when they were interned, they were not given sufficient food. They were given coppers out in the open where they could boil their water, and you took something up to them. I took a cake that was smashed to pieces while they were looking for anything hidden inside it. The Freer family kept their father in little luxuries. I took such things as Vegemite and tobacco to my father-in-law when I could get it, because we were rationed with all those things. And he was a very sick man when he left, and he was still a sick man when he came home. It was pretty hard.
Did they all survive that internment?
Well, yes, they did all survive the internment, but none of them survived much after the internment.
And how would you sum up, what would your opinion be of that sort of policy?
Well, I'm an Australian born and bred, but I think we were just as hard as any other country was. Can't say that we were soft, because we weren't. We were just as hard as any other. We treated our prisoners the way other countries treated theirs.
Yes. Your grandfather was a remittance man, I believe.
Yeah, my grandfather came from Devonshire in England, and he was what they call a remittance man. People don't know the meaning of it these days. And he came out, they arrived from New Zealand in the 1870s, and where my mother was born, and they came across to Melbourne and settled there. He drank his cheque every month, and my grandmother had to work to keep her family. It was a pretty big struggle. My mother was the eldest of the family. And
when you came to get married, your immediate relatives, they didn't object to
Oh no,
Japanese.
My father was there, and my mother was dead. My father was at the wedding, and my two brothers, I only have two brothers, and they all came. We were married in the Anglican church in Caulfield. But no, they had nothing against it. We'd grown up with these boys and gone to school with them. Matter of fact, my father used to say we had a League of Nations in our backyard, because every second neighbour was a foreigner. We had Russians and Japanese and English and Norwegian, which my father was, and many, many nationalities.
Would you recognise South Yarra today?
Oh, well, hardly. I don't even recognise the Paran Market. But Christchurch is still standing there on the corner of Punt Road, and the Methodist Church is still standing on the corner of Commercial Road.
Did anybody get back into the laundry business after Second World War, or that was the end of it?
I think Mr. Freer's family kept the laundry open while he was in the war, while he was interned. But when he died, they closed it down, you know. I think he wasn't very long back. I don't remember quite how long he was back, but his daughter kept the laundry going. She is since deceased. I think the only member of his family is George, who lives somewhere in East Geelong, George Freer. Nobody else went back into laundry work because there was nothing, you know.
It was the era of the washing machine by then.
That's right, yeah, well, that's right, they all had washing machines, but starch collars were missing. No more starch collars after World War II.